Sounds like it.
Oh, I'm not on. I've got to be on because it's going to be repeated on Breitbart next Wednesday. Okay, now, can everybody hear me? And I understand it is being recorded. A few years ago, I was asked to do the homily for Veterans Day at Pilgrim United Church of Christ. Good bunch of people down there. And about 3 days before, the reporter had an article that the Oakdale or Oakville or what is it? Oakfield. The Oakfield Post of the VFW had just voted someone out because he wasn't a real veteran. I went bonkers. I mean, what the hell's a real veteran to start with? And secondly, every veterans organization I'm aware of is struggling for membership. So I went to the VA website and looked up who's eligible for stuff. And the first line was, members of the 7 uniformed services. That was my question to start the homily. What are the 7 uniformed services?
Army.
Army.
Coast Guard.
Navy.
Coast Guard.
Air
Marines.
Force.
Navy.
Air Force. Navy.
Reserves.
Pardon?
The reserves. Coast Guard.
National Guard.
Army Air Corps. National Guard.
USO.
U.S. Paramedic Service.
Yeah.
There's a lot of very creative responses that are very, very close. But hold your seats. The Public Health Service and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA,
No.
the people that bring you the weather. So anyone. Now, there are only certain parts of the Public Health Service who wear uniforms. And the Surgeon General of the United States wears a naval uniform. That's always irritated me. But nobody really cares. The people in NOAA, when they're not wearing mukluks and all the stuff they wear at the South Pole, they wear Coast Guard uniforms. But all of these are coordinated, you know, pay scales and order of precedence at formal dinners and that sort of stuff. So anyone who served in those 7, including the reserve elements of them, whether it be the National Guard, the Air Reserve, Marine Corps Reserve, whatever it may be. So we established who is a veteran. I think there are some others that might deserve being included in there, but those are the official ones. Now, I'd like to warn you up front as I get into the more formal. No. We don't use the word formal. As we get into the interactive part of the program, those of you who cannot stand to watch a grown man cry, leave. I've been doing this for about 10 years now. I've never made it. And yesterday afternoon, I started my prep about 3 o'clock yesterday. But yesterday afternoon, I reworked the opening. And Allison, who was cooking and that's a rare day at our house. But Allison, while cooking supper, I went out and I ran it by her, and she said, "Don't do it." I thought, oh, what the hell. And I'm going to do it. Would you put my first slide on, please?
Yeah.
It's been many years since I've had an assistant instructor, like when I retired from the military.
Right?
This stuff called PTSD's been around a while. When did Homer live? Anybody remember? 2,500 years ago. Must you carry the bloody horror of combat in your heart forever? Those of you who remember reading Odyssey, the Iliad, you were reading stories of PTSD. And about 300 years later, a guy by the name of Thucydides told the story of the Peloponnesian War from the other side. Thucydides as well described the symptoms of PTSD. Flash forward to 1865. PTSD was first formalized, not by that name, PTSD. It was called battle rattle or something like that at that point. In fact, give me the next slide, please. PTSD has had many names over the years, but it's always been the same. How many people read the bestseller, 7 or 8 years ago, Cold Mountain? What a magnificent book. That is a story of one man with PTSD who walked away from the hospital at Gettysburg and walked all the way to South Carolina, where he got himself set up back in the mountains, and a whole group of them can we go to the next slide?
You bet.
A whole group of them sat around with their PTSD and lived out their lives. God, what a beautiful book, though. These are 4 names that came to mind as I was making the slide yesterday. And my father's favorite name was Battle Rattle. And to answer the question that was asked by Homer, I want to read a little piece attributed to my father. It's from a book by Michael Putzel entitled The Price They Paid. Probably the best book about Vietnam that was ever written. Probably one of the best descriptors of what causes PTSD that's ever been written. That, after all, is the price they paid. In fact, a study, the night that Michael sent me this book, which was as soon as it was published, I wanted to dig right into it, and Allison said, no. You're not starting that before you go to bed. So I sat there for about 20 minutes and I studied the cover. And at the end of 20 minutes, I had this guy's story figured out. Not down to the last detail, but I understood his story. Now, Michael is using a story I told him to tell back to us. This book is the story of a unit that I organized at Fort Hood, Texas, and took to Vietnam. The occurrences of this book were a year or so after I left. Same people in many cases. And he's at a place in the book where he's talking about a young man to whom I sent the letter no one wants to get. I'm going to ask you to put yourself in my shoes for a minute. Robert Howard, who was killed that afternoon, had really screwed up records. Can you imagine the military screwing up your records? I mean, if anybody can process, the military can process you. But the only relative we had on record was a 3-year-old. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The first sergeant had just put a bottle of Dewar's down, and I hadn't gotten into it yet. And I promptly wrote a letter to a 3-year-old saying, "Dear kid, your dad's dead." Not fun. And I had a lot of practice writing those letters. Well, many years later, Robert Howard Jr. and I met one another. And I'll see him next October, too. But Robert and I separately, he was the son of a sergeant who was killed. I was the boss that arguably got that sergeant killed. And we met one another 30 years after the war. And separately, independently, without knowing that Michael was talking to the other, we told our stories of recovery. Robert caused me to recover. I caused Robert to recover. But Robert and I still hadn't talked about this. So reading this book is where I learned the story of our recoveries. And this is a blurb about my father's death. And it says, "But Zierdt," referring to me, "knew he would never be free of his memories. He was visiting his 91-year-old father one morning in 2005 when the old man, whose health had been slipping for 3 years, had his head back on his pillow, whose health had been slipping, laid his head back on his pillow for the last time, looked up at his son, and said, 'I dreamt of Kasserine last night.' The Battle of Kasserine Pass was the first major land engagement between American and German forces. Started on February 28, 1943. Lasted 5 days. Okay, Michael goes on. The son knew he meant February 1943 when Rommel drew the 1st U.S. Armored Division into a deadly trap at the Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia. Zierdt's father had 3 half-tracks shot out from under him in that 5-day battle. And his best friend's body, missing the head, fell on him. Quote, "PTSD is forever," Zierdt wrote me some years later. I had never realized he had the same issues as I. My selfish reaction, my father was 91, I was 68 or something like that when he died. My very selfish reaction was, I've got another 25 years to put up with this crap. The longer term, yes, I can look back at my youth, my father's youth for that matter, and say, that was a symptom, that was a symptom, that was the symptom. But when you're 15 years old, especially when you're spending most of your time away from home at the age of 15, you don't pick that up in your parents. But my father carried his to the grave with him. I will too. Now, my diagnosis came 33 years after I last left Vietnam, when I flipped out. Fortunately, Dick Ridenhour was still the president at Marion. Any of you know Dick? He was a retired psychiatrist, admiral, had commanded Bethesda Naval Hospital before he came out here. I went over, Carrie Gardine was sitting there, bright and cheery as always. She looked up and with her beautiful Scottish accent said something like, "Oh my God, go on in, Bill." And I walked into Dick's office. I said, "Dick, I've got a problem." And he looked up at me, and there was no question in his mind. I mean, he made the diagnosis instantaneously, and he knew what was bugging me. Now, he didn't give me the treatment. That would have been inappropriate, I guess, treating a crazy professor when you're president of a college. But he got me in touch with the right people. Now the question comes up. Homer asked the question, will I be cured? I don't know. Nobody else knows. And if you go through the research literature, almost every bit of it has been done in the last 25 years. There's everything from a study that was done at Harvard in 1909 that said this is terribly overdiagnosed, that only 7% of the people. Now that same study, quote, "We found no one who was diagnosed more than 6 years after they left a combat area." Give me a call, for God's sake. I could have given them a list of 36 names. Moreover, more than 50% of us never do seek treatment. Let me tell you folks, that is one horrible mistake. Now, 34 years from the last time I left Vietnam until I was diagnosed, was I symptom-free? No. I was stupid. It's not normal to be sitting at your desk frozen for 2 hours, reprocessing the same item over and over again. Now, when I first became aware of Robert Howard, I reprocessed the entire day. A 23-hour day takes 23 hours to relive. The detail that came out. During the day, I took a few rounds through the helicopter, had no idea when that happened. In reliving it, 34 years later, I heard the bullets hitting the helicopter. It took me 34 years to figure out where did I screw up. Now, it didn't bring the helicopter down or anything like that. In fact, it was a real education for my door gunner. We stopped for gas. I didn't want to unplug all my communications, so I was standing on the skid of the helicopter relieving myself in front of God and everybody. And I felt this hand on my shoulder, and I turned, and there was my door gunner, just ashen white, going, pointing at the tail boom. There were 5 holes in the tail boom. Hey, welcome to the air cav, young man, was my reaction. I opened up an access panel, stuck my head in. Nothing serious had been damaged, so we got back in the helicopter and flew for another 10 hours that day. But it took me 34 years to figure out what I had done, where I had done it, and ended up with helicopter shot up a little bit. I had a lot that looked a lot worse than that one before everything was said and done. Now, hit the next slide, please. Whoops. I don't even know what it says. Okay. The incidence of PTSD, folks, I'm going to say is unknown. I mean, the study from Harvard said it's about 7%. The Rand Corporation did the best and most comprehensive study that's ever been done from about, the late 70s into the 90s. Now, the sample for that was, of course, all Vietnam. We hadn't had the 1,000 other little wars we've fought in the Middle East at that point. And a line in the Rand study was, it was not unusual to find people 31 years later still showing symptoms of PTSD. Now, the sooner the better. And are you gathering your data when they get back? Now, we've fought most of the wars in the Middle East using National Guardsmen reservists. You bring them back from Iraq, for instance. Take them up to Fort McCoy and do a screening. They do a paper and pencil test. There's an item that says, I have had a nightmare within the last 30 days. That young man, young woman, knows darn well if he marks no, he'll get on a bus tomorrow to go home to Amro. If he marks yes, he'll get on a bus tomorrow to go to Ireland Army Hospital for further workup to see if he has PTSD. Absolutely useless as a screening device. Regrettably, I can't come up with a better way right now. But that is the way your sons, daughters, grandchildren are being evaluated for PTSD. Now, women have about a double incidence of PTSD compared to men. Women are more susceptible. Nobody knows why. And you can come up with all sorts of reasons that would feed into the political non-discourse we've been having for the last several months. But we do know women are more subject. Now, you're going to evaluate them that day. They may or may not show signs of PTSD. We do know, excuse me, that suicide, which is the ultimate, peaks between 1 and 3 years. But there's a most interesting phenomenon that affects PTSD in general and suicide in particular. How many know Michelle Majewski, head of the psych department at Marion? What a wonderful woman. Several years ago, she did a year's sabbatical that she spent at the Battle Creek Veterans Administration Hospital. And she came back on her periodic visit to renew her Wisconsin citizenship or whatever she had to do. And we were talking one day, and she was talking about the second wave of Vietnam PTSD. What the hell are you talking about, Michelle? I had never heard of this. Well, one of the things they picked up on, at least at Battle Creek, and I've now read it from other VA installations, is people come home from war. If they're lucky, they get a job, they get married, they buy a car, they buy a house, they have the mortgages, they're paying too much for their 60-inch television set, all that stuff. That structures their lives. Consider back to your working days. So those of you still in your working days, you don't have any choice. Your day is determined when you get out of bed in the morning. So, went from the military structure to the structure of making a living. You hit the magical age, whatever it is at your company, and you retire. What's next? It's referred to as a state of anomie, normlessness. Structure has been removed from your life. And at that point, we're finding a spike, typically in the late 60s, of people now being diagnosed with PTSD. It was suppressed for all those years. Was mine repressed all those years? Possibly. But it was more my kid and myself than it was anything else. So you can handle this for 20 or 30 years. But when you don't have anybody or anything guiding you through your day, boom, you go nuts. I've noticed the way I retired, the way Allison has retired, are two entirely different things. I do a lot less. She does a lot more. And we each seem to have adapted to that. Now, part of that is I married a child bride, and she's so much younger than I am. But anyway, Allison and I have adapted to retirement two entirely different ways. Sometimes I don't know how we can stay in the same house. This morning, as I was filling my cereal bowl, Allison always listens to NPR in the morning. Well, I was trying to put this together because I wasn't prepared yet. And these tinny little voices talking about Lord knows what. And finally I said, turn that damn thing off. Or was I polite? Okay. This morning I was polite. That's not always the case. Now, the symptoms, which I call indicators, hit the button and let's look at this next one. Now, the first one up there is probably as much my life experience as it is study. Withdrawal. I mean self-isolation. We have a friend lives in upstate New York, 4-story house. Now, Frank Frank was one of my Cobra pilots. He never told me this, but Sheila told you. For 3 or 4 years, the family lived on the 3rd floor. Frank lived alone on the 4th floor. Self-isolation. I'm a master. I don't have to have a 4th floor. I could find a place in this room with behaviors to go along with it that I could completely isolate myself. And you all flat would not exist. Got a lot of practice at that. So this withdrawal that inability to establish friendships. If you don't even want to look at a person, how the hell are you going to become a friend? Okay? And that would be my status for weeks, at least days at a time. Can't hold a job. Yeah, I was self-employed for 10 years because I got fired by a bank that I tried to do a job for. Substance abuse. I never really had that particular problem, but so many of my friends have. And name your substance. And among the substances that are being experimented with to treat PTSD, a couple aren't working too well. One is LSD. The other is ecstasy. Now, the primary source for ecstasy in this town is in the apartments down at Main and Mar. They're not working too well. The VA has kind of disapproved them. But people find their own substance. If you have a child comes home from wherever and ends up with an entirely new friendship network, doesn't want to meet the old kids, but wants to build a new network, if she or he wants to build a network at all. Changing behavior. They come home, go to their room, close the door, turn on their own television set, or just get out of the house. And it's very different from anything you've ever seen before. And self-destructive behavior, the extreme of which, of course, would be suicide. Now, what's my purpose here today? I don't know. make you aware. Some of you have grandchildren serving right now. All of you, somewhere in your family, have people who are serving right now or have recently served. They're a mess. You know they're a mess. They know they're a mess. But the people closer to them are not confronting them. If somebody, a previous wife, and there's been a few, a previous wife, a previous boss, could have booted me right in the butt, and maybe convinced me to get a little help a little bit sooner than 34 years. So make an intervention. I was speaking to a young man. There was no follow-up on the thing. This must have been 4 or 5 years ago. He lived somewhere up in the Holy Land. And he said, you know, I come home and the whole family wants to talk to me about Iraq. What do you eat? What kind of music do they play? Do the women really dress like that? How do you play soccer in the middle of a desert? Interested in all that stuff. But at the moment, he'd bring up what he needed to talk about. I had a friend who fell out of a track and got run over by the one behind it. Okay, it's not all enemy action. But he said, whenever I bring up what I need to talk about, my dad says, it's time to catch the news. And goes over and turns on Huntley, Brinkley, or whoever the hell's giving the news these days. So, awareness. That's all I can ask of you. None of you are going to be drafted in the next couple of weeks. Tom's older than any of the airplanes that he used to fly in. So none of us are going to be redrafted and have to do it again. But any mild intervention could be enough. And hit the PTSD national website. The Veterans Administration runs the National PTSD website. Not because combat-related PTSD is any different. Michelle had me in a room with a bunch of women one time over at Marion, several of whom were rape victims. We had all the same symptoms. We were experiencing all the same problems. So it doesn't matter what the source of the PTSD is. Whether it was sexual abuse, whether it was being an EMT for 20 years. How did those people make it through 20 years without flipping out? Cleaning up messes out in the middle of Highway 41. I don't know. But many of them do end up with PTSD. A near miss in a traffic accident. There can be individual causes of PTSD, and yes, my records do indicate a couple of individual causes. It's not, none of them caused it. It's the cumulative effect. And with me, rather than any specific behavior, it was decision making. Consider this. You've got about 0.3 of a second to make a decision. You don't make the decision, everybody gets killed. If you make this decision, some will live and some will die. If you make this decision, different ones will live, different ones will die. And you know which is which. Folks, if that doesn't screw your head up, I don't know what will. So, contact me anytime. I know the Reeds always know how to get a hold of me because I occasionally get emails from each of them. Few other people in the room have my email. I'd be glad to talk to you, to any group, to a grandson coming home, to sit one down with my finger in his face saying, get some help, and here are a couple of names. So with that, I thank you for the invitation. It's been nice to be with you. I think I've enjoyed it.